Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. Justice Bret Kavanaugh officially took his seat on the Supreme Court this week, but the political fight appears to be far from over, with a bitter confirmation battle helping to reignite the debate over civility, something 2016 Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton says will only return to politics if Democrats take back Congress.
You cannot be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for, what you care about. That's why I believe if we are fortunate enough to win back the House and/or the Senate, that's when civility can start again.
Let's bring in Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, editorial page writer Kate Batchelder Odell, and assistant editorial page editor James Freeman. So Dan, you're a very civil person.
Most of the time.
What is this message from Democrats? This is in the wake of the Kavanaugh defeat for them, but it's only one Supreme Court seat.
Well, on one level, the message has been that because of the Kavanaugh Supreme Court fight, Democrats are enraged. And the idea is that it's going to animate their base, energize them, drive turnout in the November midterm election. We understand that. I think something else is going on here, Paul, which is that an aspect of the Democratic left, the progressive movement, the ones that demonstrate in Senate galleries, the ones that get themselves pulled out of Senate hearings, what I call the Code Pink left, has begun to take over the party the way the San Francisco Democrats took over the party back in the 70s and 80s. That back then was a huge loser for the Democratic Party. It made a lot of generalized voters nervous about the nature of the Democratic Party. And I think that has come back to take control of the Democrats. Most of them are playing to it. Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, you could see Hillary Clinton. I don't see how it can be a winner for them. Well,
and James, let's think about this in terms of the Supreme Court. Bret Kavanaugh heard his first two cases. Okay, he's Justice Kavanaugh now. He's on the court. So the Democratic reaction is, Cory Booker, we're going to impeach him.
Yeah.
Okay. Nancy Pelosi, we're going to look into that FBI investigation. Other people saying we should release these confidential FBI interviews in public. You know, basically raw FBI files. Let's release them in public. And others saying, you know what? Maybe we need to change the Supreme Court. It's illegitimate.
It's kind of amazing, isn't it? This point we've come to with the Hillary, it's an interesting campaign promise. We're going to be rude and insufferable until you vote us back into power. And as you said, the debate on the Democratic left, at least among people who write in left-leaning publications, has gone from should we restructure the entire judiciary or should we get rid of the Supreme Court altogether? And this idea that you don't accept the outcome when you lose and you want to restructure American government to suit your political ends, I don't think is a mainstream opinion.
Well, I think our friends on the left would say, James, that Donald Trump, rude, often crude, often nasty. So we're just giving it back in kind. What do you mean? You don't want us to play the same way as the president does? We can do that, too.
Well, they're talking about something very different from the occasional insensitive or misguided tweet. We're talking about demanding a restructuring of the American constitutional order because you didn't get the election win you wanted or you didn't get the justice you wanted on the Supreme Court. It's, I think, frightening and not very appealing, except for a very small segment of the country.
Kate, do you think we should take as seriously as I think James does the idea of this maybe adding 2 seats on the Supreme Court in 2021 if the Democrats take over? They obviously wouldn't be able to do it as long as Donald Trump is president. But could this be a campaign theme? You lose the court on majority, therefore you add seats on the court.
Absolutely, Paul. It's important to remember that the number of Supreme Court justices is not enumerated in the Constitution. And we forget how close FDR came to packing the court when he tried to do it. And it's entirely possible, given the volatile sentiment right now we have in the Democratic Party, that they could try to do something like that and succeed. So we should absolutely take that claim seriously.
What do you make, Kate, of this president's laying down this week in an op-ed in the USA Today what I think is going to be a theme for the Republican Party, which is to portray the Democrats now, between now and the election, polarize around some issues like immigration, open borders immigration, for example. He's accusing the Democrats of economic model based on Venezuela, for example, and calling them radicals.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's obviously regrettable given how polarizing it is, but I think he has a point that we have Democrats now campaigning calling for abolishing ICE. I mean, this is now getting into the mainstream. Democrats are starting to normalize it. So I think he has every right to explain to voters that even if Republicans are not delivering on everything they promise, like repealing Obamacare, there are reasons to think that the alternative is not very palatable.
As far as Trump's personality goes, we're looking at an election cycle. Trump did this earlier in his election. What people remember is the past 4 weeks dominated by the Kavanaugh hearings. And what they saw was the Democrats attacking Kavanaugh. And not only that, but after he's confirmed, after he's seated on the Supreme Court, you've got Senator Richard Blumenthal and Nancy Pelosi say they will continue to try to seek documents to drive Kavanaugh off the Supreme Court. That is what is in front of the American people right now, and that's what the Democrats are hoping that they're going to drive votes.
And you think this is not just posturing. This is something the Democrats want to do.
They absolutely want to do it. It's not just for show. They say they want to get him off the Supreme Court. I regard that as outside the boundaries of American politics, and I think most people would recognize it as such.
Okay, thank you. President Trump stumping for Republican candidates in Pennsylvania and Ohio this week as Democrats look poised to make gains in states he carried in 2016. So is the Rust Belt still Trump country?
Under Republican leadership, America is booming, America is thriving, and America is winning like never before. And we are unleashing the power of Pennsylvania shale and clean, beautiful Pennsylvania coal. Beautiful, beautiful, clean coal. We are putting our miners back to work. We are putting our steel workers back to work.
That was President Trump in Erie, Pennsylvania, Wednesday, rallying voters in a state that played a pivotal role in his 2016 victory. But Democrats are eyeing the Keystone State and others in the industrial belt in their push to take back the House and maybe even the Senate this November. It's a part of the country that Republican strategist John Brabender knows well. He was the senior advisor and media consultant for Rick Santorum's 2016 presidential run. Welcome back to the show, John.
Glad to be here.
So let's talk about these states, Pennsylvania, all the way across really the Great Lakes to Wisconsin, Illinois, and even Minnesota. They don't look very good for Republicans this year. What's going on?
Well, they don't. I mean, right now we are trailing in all the Senate races. In the governor races, we're behind in all but one, where it's Scott Walker, the only incumbent, and he's in a pretty tough race right now. And so what to me makes all this kind of fascinating is everybody keeps saying, but Donald Trump won these states, and they'll look at congressional districts in Michigan and Pennsylvania and other places. The president won by 12 points, but it's tied. Why is that? Are they leaving the president? And I think that's the wrong question. I think the question is a conservative or a blue-collar Democrat, when they vote for Donald Trump, does that mean that they are now voting for Republicans? And I don't think that's necessarily true. We didn't see it in 2016 in Pennsylvania when Donald Trump did very well in the western side of Pennsylvania and ran way ahead of Pat Toomey. Even though Pat Toomey won, Pat Toomey ended up picking up votes in the eastern part of the state that President Trump didn't. And so I think, number one, we're going to find out is a pro-Trump vote really a pro-Republican vote? And very well may not be. I think a lot of people almost see President Trump as a third-party candidate. The second thing is Hillary Clinton's not on the ballot. And, you know, we have to remember that. That was a choice election. And I would tell you, if Hillary Clinton was in all these states running for the Senate or the House, I'm guessing Republican candidates would probably be doing a little better.
Yeah, but John, you look at, say, Ohio, two-term Republican Governor John Kasich. Look at Michigan, two-term Republican Governor Rick Snyder. Look at Wisconsin, Scott Walker's running for a third term. Bruce Rauner won one term. He's really behind in Illinois. But that upper Midwest, that has been a pretty strong, that was very strong for Republicans throughout the Obama era at the state and local level. So voters were clearly willing to vote for Republicans in those races at that time. Why not now?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I think a couple things have happened. Second of all, I mean, we know historically when we're into the first term of a president, 2 years in, that the party in power, whether it be a governor's race, Senate race, or House race, is going to have some problems. So, you know, we're not going to break history is what we know.
Right.
I think so. Let's be clear with that. Second of all, what Donald Trump has done is also inspired a whole new set of Democrat voters that don't normally show up in non-presidential years. You know, people have a tendency more likely to vote against something than for something. And so if you look at the most engaged at this point, what we know is they tend to be very left-leaning, they tend to be more female, and they tend to be more younger than typically we would see in a non-presidential election. And that's because of the presidents and their opposition to the president. In fact, we've had an uptick for Republicans because on the Republican side, there was so much offense to what they saw in the Kavanaugh hearing that for the first time they're really becoming much more engaged, and that's why we're seeing some races actually tightening.
So this is a question right now at this stage of the race whether Republicans' enthusiasm can catch up to, in the wake of the Kavanaugh hearings, can catch up with Democratic enthusiasm. But I want to ask you about the economy, because Trump talked about it in the clip we saw. Things are fine, are going well. The economy growing at 4% or so after 2% for 8 years. Is that breaking through to voters at all, or are they saying, well, fine, that's good, let's talk about something else?
No, and I think this is where you get into messaging problems. For example, the tax cuts are seen as a 50-50 issue, with roughly half the people saying they like them, half people they don't. Well, when 91% of taxpayers get a tax cut, yet you have a 50-50 issue, it makes no sense to me other than say it was poorly messaged. If you go back to the exit polls in 2016, the two key issues people said they cared most about, jobs in the economy and fighting terrorism, particularly ISIS. Two areas where I don't think there's anybody in this country could argue that the president hasn't done a terrific job, yet that is not what is driving the 2018 election. And I think, frankly, that's a failure of our party in general.
They just haven't made the case for it. I mean, if you look at the press releases I get from Republicans on Capitol Hill, that's all they talk about. That's what they're sending out all the time. Trump is on the stump. He's talking about it. But is it? I mean, maybe people are just saying, you know what? Great. He made that promise succeed. Great. But let's talk about his personal decorum, or let's talk about health care or something else.
Well, and I think you've hit it right, because I've sat in a lot of focus groups, and even a lot of people that like this president, particularly in blue-collar states, they don't like the tone and rhetoric. That's number one. Number two is I think the president and our party is too easily put off message. The president likes to move on to the new instead of reinforcing everything over and over again and staying with that message. And I think that's problematic. And number three, I think the Democrats have become very unified in trying to attack this president in any way they can. And I think they've been effective at doing that.
All right. Thank you, John Brabender. We will watch the coming weeks. Still ahead, from the Kavanaugh confirmation to Medicare for all, our panel takes a closer look at some key midterm races and the issues both parties hope will drive voters to the polls. The Kavanaugh confirmation fight taking center stage in some close House races ahead of the November midterms. The abortion rights group NARAL announced this week that it would spend $1 million on an ad campaign attacking 7 House Republicans. The first ad is directed at 6th-term Congressman Peter Roskam of Illinois, who's in a tight re-election race with Democrat Sean Casten. Take a look.
Right now, women are under attack, and Congressman Peter Roskam is leading the charge. Roskam has worked in lockstep with Donald Trump, advancing an agenda that harms and silences women. Roskam even supports denying a woman the choice of an abortion in cases of rape or incest. We know what he thinks about us. Let's show Roskam what we think about him.
We're back with Dan Henninger and editorial board members Alicia Finley and Kyle Peterson, who is just back from Illinois, where he was reporting on the Roscom race. So what did you find when you were there?
Well, I think the main question is it's definitely a tight race. The main question, I think, is whether Democrats have nominated someone who is too left-wing for the district. The 6th district is very suburban. The median income, household income there is about $100,000. It runs between O'Hare Airport and the particle accelerator at Fermilab, so it's educated. This should be prime pickup territory for Democrats.
It's Henry Hyde's old seat, right? The
yes.
longstanding Republican. Okay, so you're saying that this should be an opportunity for Democrats?
Yeah, and it still may be. I mean, what Roscom, I think, is counting on is that the differences in the policies that his opponent wants and the rhetoric are the two things. So, for instance, Sean Casten, the candidate there, wants to repeal the tax bill. He wants to take the cap off the Social Security payroll tax. He wants taxpayer funding for abortions, which is why Planned Parenthood and NARAL have come in big in this race. And then on the rhetoric side, you know, when the Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore was running last year, Sean Casten tweeted that the Republican Party is officially the pedophile party. And that tweet still is out there if you want to go find it. And rhetoric of that kind, I think it's a question whether suburban moms are going to go for that in the end.
He's a green energy executive, right?
Yes.
Sean Casten is. Well, what is Roscom using to fight back?
Well, he's using his own words to fight back. I mean,
so he's saying that Casten is just too extreme for the district.
Correct. He's talking about taxes and he's talking about rhetoric. They've had 4 debates so far, and every time he brings up these tweets, he says my opponent has called Republicans the pedophile party. He's called Republican donors morons. I mean, that's the line. Wherever he goes, he says that. I think there's some play there.
And Casten is using opposition to Trump to kind of drive turnout, right? To energize Democrats, but also some maybe Republicans who are a little shaky.
Correct. I mean, he sees himself and presents himself as a teller of bold truths in a alternative facts era. He says that he is in favor of impeachment theoretically, but doesn't think that it's necessarily the best idea when you don't have enough senators to convict, because that would embolden Trump.
I guarantee you he votes for impeachment if they bring a bill of impeachment to the House. Would you say that that's fair?
I think he may.
Okay, this is one of those seats that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. So
correct.
One of those 23 seats. So this is if Roscom can hold, it means the Republicans have a chance to retain the House majority.
Right, but the swing there is interesting too, because while Hillary Clinton won by 7 points, Roscom won re-election by 18 points, and it was a similar sort of story in 2008. Obama won it narrowly, and Roscom won with a pretty handy margin. So he knows his district, and he's pretty confident that they'll put him back.
All right, Alicia, you've been following Wisconsin. Scott Walker is in a very close race as he tries to get a 3rd term. This is another state where Trump he won the election narrowly, but he won. What are the issues there?
I think, for one, the collective bargaining reform, Scott Walker's back in 2011, they reduced the negotiating leverage for public unions. Public unions are still angry and want to roll back those reforms.
Even 8 years later.
8 years later, they'll need a Democratic majority in the legislature, but Tony Evers, the Democratic nominee who's running against Scott Walker, is campaigning on that. He's also campaigning on increasing the income tax, which would help pay for Medicaid expansion and supposedly more money for roads and other kind of infrastructure.
So why is Trump as unpopular as he is in Wisconsin, even though he won? I think his approval rating is in the low 40s.
Right, but he was unpopular, recall, during the GOP primary. Ted Cruz won. And this is partly because he's just very polarizing. His personality is very ostentatious.
That's not the Wisconsin culture, is that what you're saying?
He's not quite Wisconsin nice, that way.
Okay, so that's a lot at stake in Wisconsin, because if Walker goes down, then a lot of his reforms could go.
That's right, especially, as I said, Democrats would need to control the legislature, but in the next 4 years, that is very possible. He's done it, and not just what could go, it would also prevent a lot of other reforms, like they're looking at reducing the income taxes. They're looking at doing more health care reforms with reinsurance.
Dan, what's the message here?
Well, the message is, once again, turnout. I mean, it's going to be tight elections, especially at these local levels. There's one interesting thing that happened in the past week, Paul. since the Kavanaugh confirmation last weekend, Republicans got an extraordinary amount of about over $3 million. Most of it were small donations digitally sent by individuals, which suggests there's a lot of energy out there at the individual level, which could feed into races like Roscoe's.
All right, still ahead with polls showing that health care is a key concern among voters. Both parties look to exploit the issue in the closing weeks of the midterm campaign. So who has the upper hand? With just over 3 weeks to go until the midterm election, health care is shaping up to be a defining issue as both sides seek the advantage in some tight House and Senate races. Democrats accusing Republicans of chipping away at protections for patients with pre-existing conditions, while Republicans are trying to tie their opponents to single-payer, government-run health care. Take a look at this ad running in Kentucky's 6th congressional district.
Amy McGrath wants to help Nancy Pelosi pass a $32 trillion government takeover of health care.
In my opinion, single payer is the way to go.
The Pelosi-McGrath plan is socialized medicine, and it would almost double the national debt.
In my opinion, single payer is the way to go.
We're back with Dan Henninger, Kate Batchelder-Odell, and Alicia Finley. So, Kate, let's take pre-existing conditions first. That's the issue that Democrats have been scoring well with on the campaign trail, accusing Republicans of not wanting to insure patients who have had cancer or other ailments. Is that fair?
That is completely mendacious, Paul, and what's amazing is how hapless Republicans seem to be in answering it. Given that we had a long debate last year about repealing Obamacare and ultimately didn't. Now, what Republicans were proposing was some version of what are called high-risk pools, which is basically directly subsidizing patients who are expensive instead of what Obamacare does, which is force everybody to pay higher premiums to care for the sick. The idea that mandates and regulations are the only way to care for for people with pre-existing conditions is just not true. And it's also, Paul, we hear all the time that, half of America has pre-existing conditions, but that's not how many people go try to get insurance and get denied based on a pre-existing condition, right? We have 150 million people in this country with employer-sponsored insurance where that's not an issue.
That's not even an issue. And didn't the Trump administration introduce a rule for short-term plans which can be renewable without having to go through new underwriting, which means that if you get one plan for a full year and you want to re-up it, no matter what disease you have, you can get it re-upped?
Sure, Paul, and they're basically not regulating these riders that are known as guaranteed renewability, like you say, and it protects people who get sick while they have the plan. And it's important to point out, Paul, that 49 Democrats this week voted against that rule under a disapproval measure, and Susan Collins joined them. One vote in the Senate away from that rule being rejected.
All right, Alicia, let's turn to Medicare for all, single payer. Republicans, a lot of Democrats are supporting this, but they say it's unfair to attack them for it because it's not a party position. What do you think of that?
Well, I think many of the leaders of the party are supporting it. If you see Gavin Newsom in California,
governor candidate,
also Andrew Gillum in Florida, in Jared Polis running for governor in Colorado, and his state rejected single payer a couple years ago when it was on the ballot.
About 15 or 16 senators are for it.
Yeah, I mean,
Democrats?
you also see Kamala Harris, all the future presidential candidates or aspirants, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, they're all running for it.
And is the criticism that it would cost $32 trillion, is that accurate?
I think that's right. In fact, I think that's a low ball.
You do?
Well, because people always end up utilizing more health care when it's free.
So, and that's a figure from Charles Blauhaus, who's a respected financial fiscal analyst, Dan. So it's a fascinating issue, Dan, because we'll see who wins this health care debate.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the Democratic position is they run on this idea of health care for all, take power, and then deal with the wreckage afterwards, just like they did with Obamacare. Let's try to understand something. They call it Medicare for all, universal health care, or single payer. It all means the same thing. The 155 million people who have employer-sponsored insurance, that would end, okay? You go into the government. Medicare, that system would be dismantled. Those people would go into the government. It's the only way the system works. I think Republicans have got to put that directly to their Democratic opponents who'll deny it and say, you have to explain why Medicare for all doesn't mean one government running everyone's health care.
You could just call it Medicaid for all, and it becomes much less
Everyone
popular.
goes into a Medicaid
because it would be more like Medicaid.
Where you have huge wait times. Nobody can get into a primary care doctor, let alone a specialist.
But Kate, what they would say, the Democrats would say is, look, you get all these efficiencies, no more private profit from the insurance companies. You'd have administration, low administrative costs, because the government, with its legendary efficiency, would be running the show. So look, those numbers are just not fair.
Yeah, Paul, that's ridiculous. I mean, Blothouse, who you mentioned, who did that research, he made the most generous possible assumptions in his paper about savings from administrative costs, saving from lower prescription drugs. I mean, and progressives point to these systems in small countries that they say are successful. Obviously, we take issue with that. And clearly, too, these countries have the luxury of running single-payer systems because America still drives all of the world's pharmaceutical innovation, which you can expect to come to a stop if government decides how much they're going to pay for your or my cancer medicine.
And pays for Western defense as well, that other countries don't, because they spend money on all of these entitlements. All right, still ahead, President Trump takes a swipe at the Federal Reserve after the Dow takes a dive. So what was behind this week's sell-off, and what does it mean for the real economy?
I think the Fed is making a mistake. They're so tight. I think the Fed has gone crazy.
I think the Fed is out of control. I think what they're doing is wrong. I think the Fed is far too stringent, and they're making a mistake, and it's not right. And it's, despite that, we're doing very well, but it's not necessary, in my opinion, and I think I know about it better than they do.
That was President Trump Thursday criticizing the Federal Reserve for continuing to raise interest rates despite some recent market turbulence. Concern over rising rates contributing to this week's stock sell-off. So are the president's complaints about the Fed fair? We're back with Dan Henninger and James Freeman. James, all kinds of explanations offered for why the Fed, for why the stocks fell. What's yours?
Well, I think I'm all for criticizing the Fed as a general matter. I think they make a lot of mistakes. But in this case, I think they are making the right move. And ironically, it is because I think they are comfortable now raising rates because the economy is doing so well, thanks in large part to the man we just saw criticizing the Fed.
It's a Trump tax plan, yeah.
It's kind of a commentary on how strong the economy is. And they're comfortable raising.
Some of this, I think, Dan, is the result of the change, basically the Fed withdrawing the quantitative easing, bond buying, and the zero rate policy they had for 8 years. That was deliberately intended to get people to sit on the long bond rate so that people would put money into riskier assets like stocks. So prices went up even though the real economy was kind of lousy, mediocre. So now rates are going up, like James says. People are kind of putting money elsewhere, and you think maybe you get to kind of a correction.
Well, I think that's right, Paul. I mean, you cannot overemphasize that the Fed, with quantitative easing, engaged in the greatest monetary policy experiment in the history of the world. Zero interest rates. A lot of people have money in savings, well, and that sort of thing. All of that money got pushed into stocks. I have felt for a long time that the stock market was vulnerable to some sort of outside event. It could have been interest rates going up. It could have been Donald Trump's trade wars, a weakening Chinese economy, European economies going sideways, Brexit, that sort of thing, loss of faith in tech stocks. Whatever happened, it hit stocks here this week, and they've gone down. But I think Donald Trump should give himself more credit. The deregulation that they did and those tax cuts have put such an enormous base under the economy right now that I kind of expect it'll be short term.
What about the wealth effect, so-called, James? You know, people feel wealthier because they look at their 401k, they think it's gone up. They look at their assets and they feel, hey, I'm feeling pretty good. I think I'll go out and buy that car or that, take that vacation. If they don't feel as wealthy because stocks go down, could that have an effect on the real economy?
Well, I think it's more of a real, it's not just a perception. You mentioned during the Obama years, the economy was lousy, so they try and conjure this wealth effect, people feeling better, even though the job market isn't so great. I think here you have a great job market. You have healthy companies that are expanding, and you have really people who we've basically lost a few months worth of gains in a great stock market. If you were in from election night 2016, you've still crushed it, even despite recent turbulence.
So you have to have a really much greater decline in stocks, 20, 30%, before you saw a tangible impact from a negative wealth effect?
Yeah, and I have a hard time seeing that because that underlying economy is so strong. We've got both the St. Louis Fed and the Atlanta Fed saying 4.2% growth this quarter. So
third quarter.
For third quarter, excuse me, for the third quarter. So I think there's a lot to say that this prosperity is real, and it's not just conjured by monetary policy.
Dan, Donald Trump is a real estate man, and I've never met in my entire life a real estate man who didn't want low interest rates. Is that kind of what he's talking about here?
Yeah, I would say so. He's a businessman, and you know, most businessmen think they could run interest rates better than the Federal Reserve. I'm sure the Fed isn't paying much attention to them.
Well, that's an interesting point. They're not.
No.
So far, there's no evidence that they are.
No, but as you're suggesting, with quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve is under enormous pressure to get this interest rate increase right. It's like threading a needle. There's no question that they have a big job ahead of them not to raise too quickly or too high. It could go the wrong way. And Trump's sitting here on an election in November, and obviously, as president, he's nervous about what they might do.
Well, I think that Trump, if he stayed quiet, he might make it easier for the Fed not to raise rates, James. It's when they feel under political pressure and you got politicians banging on them, keep rates low, you can begin to get markets raise questions about the credibility of the Fed and its independence.
Yeah, it is a question for December. Are they going to raise because they feel like they have to in response to this? I think if they're feeling pressured to meet expectations, this week's inflation number maybe took the heat off them a little bit. It was, I think inflation ought to be 0, but it was pretty close to where they like it, or a little over 2%. So they've got some breathing room here.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. When we come back, amid rising tensions, the Trump administration takes a harder line on China. What the tough talk means for American foreign policy, next.
The American people deserve to know that as we speak, Beijing is employing a whole-of-government approach, using political, economic, and military tools, as well as propaganda, to advance its influence and benefit its interests in the United States. China wants nothing less than to push the United States of America from the Western Pacific and attempt to prevent us from coming to the aid of our allies. But they will fail.
That was Vice President Mike Pence calling out China in an address last week that was largely overshadowed by the Kavanaugh confirmation. But my next guest says that speech could signal the biggest shift in U.S.-China relations since Henry Kissinger visited Beijing in 1971. Walter Russell Mead writes the Global View column for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome, Walter. Good to see you again.
Hey, Paul.
So just define what you think the strategic shift in policy is.
Well, I think the vice president was signaling that just as China has adopted a whole-of-government approach to changing the balance of power with the U.S. is looking at a whole-of-government policy in response. So everything from trade policy to military policy to alliance and development policy, the U.S. is now going to start looking through a China lens and using every instrument the government has, federal government has, to push China back or prevent China from changing the balance.
So that would be manifest, say, in new tariff policies, for example, tougher trade negotiations. How would it manifest itself, say, militarily and diplomatically?
Well, I think militarily you'll see, well, we've already got some of that, which is the large military buildup, and I think this is a signal it will continue. And these new military assets, clearly a proportion of them is going to the Western Pacific, where there's been talk that the balance between the U.S. and China is shifting in China's favor. Diplomatically, I think the U.S. is going to continue to work with Japan and other very close regional allies to encourage other countries who are willing to stand up with China. I suspect it means you could even see something like a revival of the TPP, though I think it might be the Trump-Pacific policy rather than the original idea. But he's moving. He's also moving on human rights, interestingly, to challenge China on human rights.
Yeah, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, that trade agreement with 11 or so nations. What about China's? I mean, does this mean, first of all, that the bet that a lot of people made, and I was one of them, that China could be brought in 15, 20 years ago into the normal Western rules of trading and behavior? Does that mean that bet failed?
Not quite, Paul, because it seems to me that actually, if you think about it, the goal of U.S. policy today is still to try to bring China into a stabler, more constructive relationship with that international system. That China's not going to go away.
Right.
But China, I think, has made in order to really fit into the international system, China would have to make a lot of economic changes at home. And the calculus in Beijing has been that the risk of international confrontation is less than the risk of domestic repercussions. And I think, we're trying to change that calculus.
And I mean, a lot of people in China think that this is just Trump. Trump is short, and maybe he's a short timer. We're not going to see this continue if Trump leaves. So let's sit tight, ride it out. You don't think so? You think this is a bigger shift than just this president?
I think that's right. I certainly talk to a lot of Democrats, and what I hear is that the problems they have with Trump are maybe on Russia, maybe on human rights generally, but China seems to be an area where the U.S. has been moving toward consensus for a while.
And that consensus is for this stronger, let's change China's behavior policy. What do we want to see from China? What does China need to do?
Well, Trump's slogan, and he keeps coming back to this, is reciprocity. That China should extend to others the same privileges that others extend to China. So most recently we've heard this in terms of, well, if China is going to ban U.S. journalists and others from Tibet, does that mean that Chinese representatives can operate freely all over the U.S.? If U.S. information companies have to comply with all kinds of Chinese restrictions, does that mean that Chinese companies can just freely run around the United States? So trying to come to some kind of bringing China into a system where it doesn't exploit its trading relationship, but there's a real set of rules that bind all participants, I think is where we're headed.
And do you
would like to go?
Do you support that in general? We don't have a lot of time, but in general, do you support this shift?
Yes.
You do?
In general, yes.
Because you think that otherwise China could essentially get away with bad behavior, and then we end up in a worse position 5-6 years from now.
That's exactly right. That they are pushing toward increasing their strength, using manipulation of the international system to increase their strength for a challenge.
All right. Thank you, Walter. Great to have you here.
All right.
We have to take one more break. When we come back, hits and misses of the week. Time now for hits and misses of the week. Kate, start us off.
Paul, this is a miss this week for Trump for saying this week that his administration is going to allow this year-round sale of a higher concentrate of ethanol. And he said basically that right now it's not allowed because of pollution concerns, but EPA is going to look at changing this, which it's not even clear it's legal. But Paul, Trump imagines himself a political outsider, and in many ways he is, but there's pretty much nothing more predictable than a pre-election ethanol stop in Iowa.
All right. Thank you. Kyle.
I will give a miss to Taylor Swift, who waded into politics for the first time this week in her home state of Tennessee. On Instagram, she said that she is never, ever, ever going to vote for Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn, calling the senator's record appalling and terrifying. Now, Senator Blackburn did the right thing, which is to shake it off. But the question is there nothing that's free of politics anymore? Taylor Swift has as much free speech as anybody else, but also a lot of Republican fans, and she's just created a whole lot of bad blood.
All right, Alicia.
This is a miss to ExxonMobil, which donated $1 million to a campaign to promote a carbon tax, as well as Bill Gates, who endorsed a carbon tax on the referendum in Washington state. In Washington, it would start at $15 per ton of carbon. The IPCC noted this week that you'd need a carbon tax of $5,500 to even do anything to reduce climate change. This is just another redistribution mechanism for electric car subsidies, et cetera.
Dan.
Well, I'm giving my miss to the U.S. Postal Service with the predictability of the fall hurricane season is raising the rate on first-class stamps to about 55 cents. The idea is it's going to make them more competitive. I think the big question is if they can ever be minimally competent anymore. Nobody more deserves to be privatized.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you all. That's it for this week's show. Thanks to all of you for watching. I'm Paul Gigot, and we hope to see you right here next week.